All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest webcast. My name is Abdullah Tamer. I'm the incoming clients and markets leader. Of course, these webcasts used to be run by our predecessor, Stephen Anderson. He timed it quite well, but look forward to engaging with you all today. We've branded this Resilience in Practice. Of course, there's a lot to talk about today, and I've got my esteemed guests, as usual, Richard Boxshall, our chief economist in the region. We've got Dr Bashar El-Jawhari, who leads our offerings in supply chain, and of course, Samer Omar, who drives our cyber business. So looking forward to a very fruitful conversation with all three. Incidentally, they're based, so Richard's with me here in the UAE. Samer is with us in Riyadh, and Dr Bashar in Qatar. So this was not planned, I assure you. And the format for this is really a kind of a discussion, really. We want to hear your questions. We want to be able to have an open conversation. Of course, we like to always anchor this in the context of the macro picture and the economic shifts that we're seeing here. Of course, it's been challenging times, to say the least, in terms of what we've seen. 20% of LNG and energy supply effectively impacted globally in the market. We're seeing a lot of shifting priorities, government interventions. So we'll start with our colleague, Richard Boxshall, who's with me, who'll help us anchor it. And then we'll go into some questions with the rest of our guests here today. So over to you, Richard. I guess the overall picture, just set the scene for us. What are we seeing? And then maybe we'll deep dive a bit in terms of what it means for specific industries, specific government responses on that.
Yeah, sure, great. Well, thank you, Abdul. It's great to be back. It's been a few weeks since we did one of these, and since we did one of these, an awful lot has changed.
Only a little bit.
In the region. So it's good to sort of come back and start thinking about what's actually happened, what the implications are, and then obviously what that means for ourselves, our clients, and our people. So what I thought might be helpful to start with is just to give a very quick overview of some of the data points that have come through over the course of the last few weeks, which start to paint a picture about the impact of the conflict on our region. Now, many of these points I'm sure you will have heard or be familiar with, but actually putting them all together starts to show just how significant, I guess, the impact is, at least in the short term, and also how broad-based it is. So I've got two slides here just drawing out a few of those data points. I'm not going to go through all of them, but really just to highlight a few before I dig into a couple in a little bit more detail. So you mentioned about crude and LNG and the derivative exports, huge downward impact on the exports that are coming out of the region. So significant that's obviously had a global impact. And those reductions in exports have obviously fed through to prices. We're fairly familiar with what's happening with oil prices, but the jet fuel doubling is one that really stood out to me. And obviously that impacts the whole globe and this region in particular. So it's an indirect impact, if you like, of what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz and the crude oil impact. But of course, it's not just that. In the region, the flights themselves have been cancelled and curtailed. 20,000 flights in March were cancelled, which is an absolutely incredible number in and out of the region. And then now capacity, airline capacity in and out of the region has also been significantly reduced. I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But again, the downward capacity is huge. Now, it's arguably short term, so these are short-term impacts, but quite significant. There are other impacts on business confidence and investor confidence, on the labour force and also financial markets, some of which is being mitigated. And again, we might touch on this later. But maybe just a couple of points to highlight here. Sovereign spreads have widened in the region by 30 basis points, which basically means it's seen as a much more risky place, not surprisingly, than before, but it also has impact on lending rates into the region. So that will lead to tighter financial conditions, other things equal. So look, there are just a few highlights from a number of data points that I guess are coming through, and these are across the region. What I wanted to do is just dig into a couple in a little bit more detail and do a bit of compare and contrast to what happened in COVID. It all feels a little bit COVID-y. And maybe it starts to give us a sense of how significant these impacts are. Have we seen them before in COVID, and what the recovery path might look like? So here I'm showing a slide about the impact on aviation, on flights, flight capacity in and out of the region. And again, you can look by airport in the bottom left chart there, and you'll see huge reductions in airline capacity in and out of the region. 50, 60+% in some of our key airports. Now we compare that to what happened in COVID, and actually it looks fairly similar. So for those that think that it feels a bit like COVID, well, actually the data looks a little bit like COVID. Now we don't exactly know the recovery path that we're going on, and this is one of the key uncertainties. How long will this conflict last? Will it be low level? Will it be fully resolved? You know, there are lots of uncertainties, and you know, we could talk about scenarios to help us plan through that. But in the meantime, you know, just taking a reference point of COVID, well, it took almost 3 years for flight capacity to come back to where it was pre-COVID. Now that's the bad news. The good news, I would say, is I think an awful lot was learnt through COVID. There's much more resilience in the system as a result of lessons learnt through COVID. And also, as we all know, anybody that's watched this webcast in the past, we went from strength to strength. When the recovery finally came about, we in the region, in all of these indicators, went from strength to strength. I've got a similar picture here for hotel capacity. So again, the left chart shows hotel capacity in Dubai, and we're comparing what's happened over the last month with what happened in COVID. And again, you've seen this very similar drop-off. So very significant, very substantial, quite painful for the hotel operators. But again, it was quite similar to the patterns that we saw in COVID. And again, the recovery took around 2 years to get back to pre-COVID levels. But again, the same point applies. Lessons were learned, there's more resilience. And when that sector did come back, it came back very strongly indeed. Just one final point to make on the broader data economic trends picture is around business confidence. This is a data point that I'll often refer to, and that's around the Purchase Managers Index. So all of these data points are quite live, real-time data, so they're quite useful to track what's happening in the economy in near real time, and PMI is one of the best indicators that we have to track what's happening with non-oil private sector. And again, here we've seen quite significant drop-offs in business confidence or business activity through March, as expected. I think what's a little less expected is that the UAE shows quite a lot of resilience, at least in the last month's number. So again, this is one to track, along with some of the other indicators I mentioned. So yeah, with that,
March is definitely not a great month when you start comparing it back to COVID. Before we pivot into Samer and Dr. Bashar, maybe a couple of comments on, and I know we've got the framework and we're talking about how clients respond, recover, reinvent, but maybe a bit of what you're seeing from an industry lens. Of course, we all take a look around us and we see things like consumer markets and retail, but a bit of that, and more importantly, are we seeing some consistency in terms of how governments are responding across the region?
Yeah, so actually I've just got a couple more slides on this to help show this. So again, one of the things that we saw and learnt through COVID was this phased response through and out of the crisis. And I think it's quite helpful for us to think about this right now. So we have this respond phase that I guess we're in right now. And this speaks to our government clients as well as our business clients. We have to respond, governments have to respond to help the economy survive and sustain, and obviously businesses need to do the same, and that's a lot around sustaining survivability through cash flow. Hopefully we are going to pivot fairly soon into, I guess, what we might call the recovery phase, and this is where we get a bit of normalization. Maybe we're in a phase where we're starting to think about normalization. And then ultimately, we want to get to a rebuild phase. Now, again, with COVID, and I was alluding to that a moment ago, the rebuild phase is really thinking about the new normal. So there will be lessons learned, geopolitical lessons, for example, that we've learned, geopolitical risks that we've learned, that in the rebuild phase, we can make sure that we can start adapting and addressing. And I think maybe some of the other panelists might speak to this when we talk about supply chain resilience and we talk about cyber resilience. But anyway, this is a framework. We've sort of set it out here about firms and government responses. In the very short term, what we're looking for governments to do, for example, is timely, targeted and temporary responses. We're seeing some of that. So timely means right now. And it's not just announced right now, but it's available right now. So that's around having the administrative infrastructure to be able to get some kind of support package out into the economy. So we've seen central banks, for example, respond by offering more favorable liquidity terms, and that can impact straight into the economy through the banking system. So that's timely, targeted. So targeted responses are elements and segments of the economy. That might be cash transfers, it might be regulatory forgiveness. So we've seen this in the housing market, for example, certainly here in Dubai, where there are more favorable terms for paying rent. And then the third important thing, at least in this very sort of dangerous phase, the respond phase, is around temporary, and that's because we hope it's temporary. And these support packages, they can cost a lot of money, and they need to be withdrawn as we move into these different elements. So we've got a few of the response packages here, but it's also worth saying that some of the economies and the states in the region are feeling pain points slightly differently, and so their response packages will deviate as a result of that. But maybe I'll just pause there.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, I think it'll be good, Samer, if that's okay. I can't see Samer. I'm hoping I can see him. So there you go. So Samer, I know that cyber is an agenda, because there's been, of course, a lot of focus on this area, particularly here in the region. Definitely has reached the board level. There's been a lot of readiness. So where does it stand in terms of that respond and recover phase? And what are you hearing from the CISOs and the CEOs across the region? Maybe set that context for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. I think it's important to note that I just concluded a week-long session with 25 Saudi CISOs. So I have a very fresh perspective of what they're seeing and what they're telling us. And number one, they're saying that they've seen a shift to more coordinated, multi-layer cyber activity. So more sophistication at a much faster pace. They're also telling us that they now understand, and as do their boards, that cybersecurity is a geopolitical issue. The impact of cyber goes way beyond the boardroom. This has become an awakening that the evolving IT risk landscape has to transform and become from a lens of business risk. So I think what the CISOs are telling us is consistent with what we heard CEOs tell us in our survey, which is 57% of CEOs were saying they're increasing their focus on cyber because they now realize that this is a business strategic imperative. So that increased focus is because they understand that operating under disruption, decision-making under pressure, and maintaining trust is essential for an organization to succeed. So CISOs are also realizing they have to become more strategic, they have to become more business-facing leaders, and they even have to become geopolitical advisors. And CEOs have to accept that CISOs now belong at the boardroom and in the executive row as key advisors. So I think cyber now enables resilience in a volatile environment, and the voice of the CISO needs to be heard and more effective these days, which means that they have to continue to transform themselves, including the way they deliver messages to their audience.
Thanks, Samer. I'm going to pivot actually quickly to Dr. Bashar, and maybe I'll come back on the point of critical infrastructure. So Dr. Bashar, of course, you work quite a lot in the industrial space, asset capital intensive industries. Maybe a bit of what you're seeing, again, does it marry up with what Richard was talking about in terms of what we've seen in that supply chain and how that industry has handled it?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. With respect to supply chain, especially of raw materials coming into factories and so on, insurance in particular has increased significantly, and that costs some of these raw materials in some cases to double, triple, and even more in cost. That's coming into through either Oman or through Saudi to feed even into Qatar and Bahrain, Kuwait, and elsewhere. So that's one layer of complexity that was added. However, at the same time, you see that there was a positive reaction to that, whereas some countries, the like of Saudi, saw it as an opportunity for logistics rather than a handicap. Same for Oman, and I can speak to that, where how they turned it, instead of just responding in a reactive way, started looking at it, would this create an opportunity for us?
Yeah, thanks. And maybe, Samer, anything you can comment in terms of the critical infrastructure component? Again, have we seen changes in terms of how clients see those in the context of the volatility that we're seeing, or have the frameworks that have been developed in the past kind of continued and have proven to be robust enough in terms of how they've responded to the...
Well, I think the region is definitely much more mature than it was years ago, but the reality is we're living in a hyper-connected world, and most of our infrastructure is now digitally savvy. So we have IT, OT, and IoT hyper-connected in smart cities, and that means more attack surface, and that means more risk. So while the readiness is higher than it's ever been, is it enough? Not really, because the pace of attack, the sophistication of attack, the number of vulnerabilities, and also the advent of new emerging technologies. Quantum is around the corner. AI is having a big say in the world of defense of cybersecurity infrastructure, as well as cyber offense against that infrastructure. One other thing I want to say is, think of cyber as the great equalizer, okay? And what I mean by that is, today you can have a small nation state or an individual using cyber prowess and expertise attack a superpower with success if they find the right vulnerabilities. So, that's quite interesting and scary when you think of the implications of that. At the same time, the maturity of larger nations should and is usually more sophisticated or more mature than those of the others. So, yeah, so I think our infrastructure is, and the statistics tell us that it's under constant attack. We're better at defending, but that doesn't mean that we've protected against all things. So resilience is the key. How quickly we can detect, how quickly we can respond. It's more about what's the minimum viable operation, and how do we make sure that we maintain that.
Thanks.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just sort of add to that point. I mean, we have data that suggests that there are maybe somewhere between nearly 100 and 200,000 cyber attacks in the UAE per day. Yeah, 70% are believed to be linked to state actors, but that's a phenomenal number. And maybe to Samer's point, this is a good example where this is about thinking about a new normal. In this instance, it's about the absolute criticality of cyber resilience at the highest level of firms, because the scale of this and the impact of this is significant.
And maybe, Samer, to your point, as you mentioned, and we were discussing this over the last couple of days in terms of the advances in AI, and I guess what is our how are clients approaching it from the discussions that you're having? Because I guess it's being viewed in terms of the source of those attacks, but in some instances it's also being used to help build better, smarter, effective ways in addressing those.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the race is on, right? Offense versus defense. And while companies are doing their best job in investing in the defense, they're realizing that you really can't protect against everything all the time. So it's more now about how we can be resilient in the face of an attack, identify and recover quickly. And then when you look at, again, I mentioned AI before, if you follow the news and what Anthropic did with Mythos, which is now restricted to researchers, it demonstrated capabilities of rapidly detecting and finding vulnerabilities 0 days across a plethora of systems, some of which were not even detected for 2 decades by human researchers. So what does that tell us? That tells us that in the wrong hands, AI can be a very, very disruptive force. So now decisions are being made by boards and executives more on trust, security, and resilience, not just on cost and efficiency.
So maybe I'll pivot a little bit, and it's a question for both yourself and Dr. Bashar, but maybe I'll ask Dr. Bashar to comment on this first. So of course, you're going to have a lot of focus and scrutiny on both supply chains and cyber, and the balance and the trade-off that clients need to make between, what do I need to do to make my network more resilient, and the economics of the costs that it would take to make us a lot more resilient. So what are your observations? What's your advice in terms of clients grappling with the cost versus resilience angle?
I'm going to build on some of what Samer spoke about. He spoke about early warning or detection. This is one of the key points also in supply chain, having proper early warning detection platforms or units, also leveraging AI for sentiments, for geopolitics, and so on, that allows you to really see things or forecast the potential of something disruptive coming in the way, including even rainfall. Droughts can actually cause food security issues or supply issues. So the first point is the early detection, and I want to confirm that it's in a similar fashion to what Samer has spoken about. Now, how do I build resilience around that is the other point. Always, if I'm pro-planning or proactive, the cost is much less than reacting to an event that happened. And the fact that I can look at my value chain or supply chain all the way from the source until it goes into my production, for example, or my warehouses, and look at vulnerabilities across the value chain, whether it's ports, vessels, potential attacks, droughts, any of it, geopolitics, and have scenarios planned for these, and meaning simulated, and then eventually plans that put in place to accommodate that. At some point, I would like to maybe give an example of how that can be practical from that point. Another thing I would just like to add, I think more and more now the region, GCC countries, are seeing the importance of resilience regionally also, not domestically only, but regionally. It's becoming more evident that they need to work together. So having, for example, railway infrastructure will be extremely important for them. Connecting also hubs, specific hubs that they can build and distributed across the GCC to support each other will be a critical thing to do. Those kind of things to build resilience in the next 12 months or so will be also critical.
course, have been the topic of discussion for years in some instances. Maybe Samer, from your end, that cost versus resilience component. I mean, you must see something similar on the cyber front and the demands when it comes to how much as an entity should I dedicate in order to beef up and mitigate any of those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when a resilience program is conducted effectively, the business continuity as well as the BIAs really tell you from the business's mouth what the cost of an impact is. And then if you use that, then you can start looking at risk quantification and valuing what the investment versus the return is. I don't think enough organizations do that very well. We've started seeing an increase in organizations asking us to have those conversations. But also on the supply chain, I think what Dr. Bashar said is very important. Is while being proactive and planning is important, what we're seeing now is that you need almost a real-time view of your ecosystem, so a constant dashboard, because, and this has put more pressure on increased focus on third parties and vendors. Think of it as a domino effect. If one of your suppliers who your ecosystem is heavily dependent on has a cyber breach and they have access to your network and you're susceptible to that attack, then that cascading effect damages not only your organization, but the entire supply chain. So I think that hypervigilance is necessary. And going back to the original question, yes, there are techniques and there are ways to quantify risk and to be able to justify the spending on return on investment or return on value. I just don't think enough organizations connect the dots. I'll give you one example. We talk to organizations where the CISO does not have visibility over the resilience plans and the BIAs, and yet they're hunting on what use cases they should be defending against, right? At the same time, within the BIA, the business has already told you where their crown jewels are and where their critical assets and what the impact of that attack is. So what we've been preaching or suggesting is what we call becoming more of a digital trust ambassadorship, where horizontally across the organization, cyber, resilience, privacy, and all the key risk owners work together, share information, and then they can quantify as well as qualify their defenses.
Thanks, Samer. Richard, maybe pivoting back on what our clients and general corporations will be looking for. What kind of indicators, economic indicators? Because obviously, as you rightly say, we're not sure. Because I remember you talking about some of those scenarios, and it's anyone's guess at the moment. Although it looks like it's landing on the protracted kind of scenario. But for now, what are some of those economic indicators that clients should be looking out for in this environment that kind of helps them then address and react, I guess?
Yeah, so look, let me just first add a point to just give an example of, I think, what Bashar and Samer were referring to, which is we've seen in the UAE, by the way, that the authorities have activated a real-time stock monitoring across over 600 retailers. So if you remember, one of the concerns early on in this conflict was, will there be enough groceries in the store? And actually, I think this is an example where you can get a real-time monitoring and you can start building resilience and confidence. And then the retailers, for their part, found new ways or different ways to bring in the goods and services, primarily through air rather than just through the sea. But you can see, this is it in practice, and it meant such a lot in those really uncertain moments when we didn't know where it's going to go. Now, when we look forward, and I guess there's a question about planning through uncertainty, and one of the ways really to do this is using scenario planning. The idea around scenario planning is you try and think through what are the most important and critical uncertainties, and one of those is duration. For us, we just don't know how long this will last. There are good reasons to think it might be over in a couple of weeks. There are also very good reasons.
Somewhat similar to COVID as well, right?
Exactly, yeah. And there are very good reasons to think it might be protracted. And then, we might think, and an organization will think what's most important to them, but we might also think, for example, what is the nature of the peace? Is it going to be a stable peace, or is it going to be an unstable peace? And through this, you can start identifying different potential futures, and you can articulate them. But then against that, you can start putting some of these indicators, both an assumption, but also things to look out for. And for this region, it's the key indicators that matter and the key indicators that will be affected. Oil, LNG matter. They are still big drivers of the economy, and we've got real-time data. We need to look through a little bit the immediate sort of peaks and troughs, but we need to sort of get a sense of whether it's drifting down or drifting up. At the moment, it's been oscillating, I would say, around that $100 mark. And I think that means that, you know, that's probably an indication that we're in this protracted, stable-ish piece, such that it is. But then we need to look at these people flows, and I gave a few examples. We can look at what's happened with aviation in terms of the capacity, seat capacity, and we need to see that picking up, and then the utilization of that picking up. And then the PMI indicator, which I indicated earlier, is also a good real-time indicator of what's happening with businesses on the ground, right? And that's actually a key measure of what's happening with the non-oil economy. So these are all important. Inflation's an important one. And then some of the financial indicators. So what's happening with financial conditions, for example, interest rates, which are a derivative of that spread that I mentioned earlier. So these are all indicators that we can start to look at to paint that picture. And really it's trying to look through the spikes and just sort of see, are we seeing a trend down or a trend up? And then we can start getting a sense, are we moving into a recovery phase, as I think hopefully we are.
I mean, Dr. Bashar, how many of those economic indicators, because I know in supply chains, fuel costs matter, of course, transportation matters, but again, how can you plan for that broad set of scenarios? You know, so again, how would you advise clients and companies to kind of tackle that in this instance?
Yes, thank you. Insurance is actually one of the key ones. I'll give a practical example, maybe to bring it to life here. We are working with one of the GCC countries, and they wanted to build supply chain resilience for their stocks, strategic stocks, meaning rice, sugar, oil, baby formula, things like that. And one of the first things we did, we actually mapped the supply chain for all of these strategic commodities, all of their SKUs and so on. And it was interesting to at least see one or two examples. One, they discovered most of the rice comes from one country, over almost 90% of it. Baby formula comes from another country, almost all of it. So that's an indication that I need to look into multi-sources as a way of reducing my resilience on a one knot that may fail. The other thing we have done is we looked at the flow of the goods from the ports and from the manufacturers or the producers through ports and so on. We discovered there is one port that's continuously congested because everything goes through it. And then again, you start planning for how you can reroute before you get trapped into that congestion and have proper planning for it. The last thing I would say, and I come to cost in particular, if you have that platform that does early warning with some AI empowered, and this is an example of one that we have built for another GCC country, it helps look, let's say, at the drought. And now I know rice will be a problem, let's say, in India. Having that view for what's coming next season allows me to lock contracts with the favorable terms today with other producers, maybe, let's say, from Thailand or Vietnam or somewhere else. And that helps me control that cost versus reacting to it once it's hit me. And that's, again, being proactive can help me with my cost. Unfortunately, while some governments in our region started paying attention to it, few have acted. Some will still need to actually move or enhance that. But if you look at the private sector, it is not as well thought of having supply chain resilience in the sense that we are talking about. And I think that is something that we need to help our local industries eventually to get to that level of sophistication where they can forecast issues, plan for it, and eventually control the associate cost that comes with the surprise. So this is really how I go back to, it's a proactive planning that controls your cost versus a reactive one.
Thanks, Doctor. We're gonna just get a few questions through, if that's okay, and before we wrap up. Samer, there's a question around, because obviously we heard a little bit around which industries are being impacted more than others. From your perspective, when it comes to some of those state actors, are there, I mean, we spoke a little bit about critical infrastructure, but are there specific sectors and industries or a lens that you want to bring from a risk angle there?
Yeah, I mean, what the data tells us are if it's nation state, they're going after critical infrastructure providers, they're going after government and public sector, key government and public sector. They're after information, they're after infrastructure, they're not after money. If they're financially motivated, then they're going after, obviously retail and banking sector. So it really depends on the source of attack and what the motivation is. Obviously, in a heightened situation that we're in, we're seeing much more of the nation state type. And by the way, you'd be surprised at how many different people get involved. As I said earlier, cyber is a great equalizer. So you might have people who are hacktivists who are siding with one side or another, now participating and making attacks on infrastructure just because they feel passionate about one side or the other. So again, I would say that government, public sector, critical CNI are the targets, the most targeted recently. But that's not unusual. In normal times, we would say that it would be financial sector and anything that has to do with retail and transactions.
Thanks. Dr. Bashar, question around, there's been a lot of focus over the past few years on localization, local content. I'm presuming that's helped. Do we anticipate any changes or your reflections on what's happened and what that means from a localization angle? Although you mentioned that there's also more that needs to be done within the GCC, I guess.
Yes, this is a great question, actually, and I'm glad someone asked it. Saudi is probably on the forefront of this localization agenda. If we look at it, I'll come to other countries. Generally speaking, all GCCs countries have been looking into industrializing and diversifying from energy sectors. But Saudi in particular, they've already now have over 11,000 factories operating, and there are about 2,000 more being licensed at this point in time. So that tells you they are building their infrastructure from logistics to support that, industrial cities to support that, and ports to support that. So, and the intent is eventually they want to get to what we refer to as industrial clusters, like a food industry cluster, as an example, or automotive cluster. And the idea here is I make my suppliers next door versus I have to rely on someone that is hundreds and maybe thousands of miles away. So that's an absolute lever for building supply chain resilience.
Thanks. And maybe there's a question which I kind of know the answer to, which is around, of course, higher oil price. Isn't that good for the region? But I can almost guess what you would say, but go ahead.
Well, actually, it's more nuanced. It is genuinely more nuanced than that because, and again, this is about supply side resilience. The Saudis have actually been very effective at rerouting a lot of their oil over to the Red Sea, Jambu, around 6 or 7 60 to 70% of the lost oil that was going through the Straits of Hormuz is now going out there. So they've still got a good amount of oil getting out into the market, and the prices shot up. So net, actually, they might be benefiting right now. That is in contrast to some other GCC economies where the oil price has gone up, but their production or their ability to export production has just plummeted. And so it doesn't really matter what the price is, the revenues and the export revenues coming in from oil or gas or other hydrocarbons has plummeted. So the picture is a bit nuanced, and Saudi and I guess Oman are in a place to potentially benefit, and maybe a little bit the UAE because they have the option of Fujairah, but Kuwait, Bahrain and Qatar, they're stuck, at least at the moment. And again, as we think through at some kind of recovery phase, I'm sure they might want to think about alternative ways of getting oil and gas out of their states.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, I think we're running out of time, so I want to thank our guests today in terms of the frank and open discussion that we've been able to have. I think we heard a lot about the macro picture, responses within the region. Of course, deep dives a bit into cyber, supply chain. I'm looking forward for the future kind of webcasts where we'll hopefully kind of deep dive into some industries. So we'll plan those, and thank you all for joining us, and look forward to you joining us again for our next Resilience and Practice webcast. Thanks all.